The studio and Bruce Hawker in the Sky News Centre. Thanks both for joining us. I want to look at the COAG meeting that's taking place here in Canberra on Friday, the final meeting of state and federal leaders for the year. And it's quite clear the Prime Minister does want to, in these final weeks of the year before heading into an election year, shift the focus as much as she can away from that slush fund issue and onto her more positive policy agenda. Now, there will be discussion on things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the Gonski education reforms. But the biggie this week, this Friday, will be the electricity market. Now, we know the Prime Minister's copped a lot of grief and the government generally has copped a lot of grief over the impact of the carbon tax on electricity prices. And Tony Abbott and the Coalition aren't going to let up in this campaign right up until the next election. So the PM is now trying to shift a bit of attention onto what has been a big driver of power price rises in recent years, this so-called gold plating of electricity infrastructure. Overinvestment, as she sees it, in the poles and wires to guarantee we don't have any blackouts. Now, she's put on the table a number of reforms to give consumers more power, to also deregulate the markets in these states, something the states would be required to do. But she's facing a bit of pushback from the states, particularly from Queensland. They're not interested in deregulation. Why? Well, their Energy Minister pointed out to us this afternoon on lunchtime agenda the specific issues with Queensland being a state where a lot of people live in the regions.
Deregulation could well mean that that money now has to be borne by individual consumers in the regional Queensland areas. And that's why deregulation, as a bold statement, holds no attraction for us at all. The cost could escalate power bills by hundreds of dollars throughout the regional Queensland area.
He pointed out that they have a policy there in Queensland where just because you live in a regional or remote area, you shouldn't have to pay more for your electricity. But that costs money, obviously. That's a part of this regulation. And to get rid of that, he argues, would cost those regional consumers. Now, the federal government disputes that, says you can still deregulate and look after those people. And the Prime Minister's plan, she argues, will save households right around the country around $250 a year. Grahame Morris, what do you think about these electricity reforms? Will they happen, for starters? And what's the politics of this?
And methinks that the Prime Minister has a current of concern, a spark of panic, is becoming bilious about bills. This is all about shifting the blame. You know, everyone knows that the electricity bills are coming in now and they're starting to hurt. And the Prime Minister has finally woken up. Now, she could simply say, well, look, that is what my carbon tax was designed to do. It was designed to push up everybody's electricity prices. I'm sorry, but that's the game. No, we don't concede that at all. We're trying to shift the blame onto the poor old electricity people and now the premiers. You know, a bit of responsibility for things can go a long way in politics and a long way in communicating a message. And the Prime Minister is ducking and weaving on her own message. It was the carbon tax is a big part of this. Why not say it?
Well, I guess the government's argument is more nuanced, that the carbon tax was meant to push up prices for the big emitters. Households were specifically reimbursed or compensated for the impact.
Yeah, but the prices still went up. You know, this is all about, hey, this is going to hurt us politically. Let's give the premiers a bit of a nudge. Well, they're entitled to nudge back and say, hey, PM, I think you've got a bit to do with this.
Is it, Bruce Hawker, a difficult one for the government now to try and argue that it wants cheaper electricity prices, when, as Grahame says, the whole point of a carbon tax is to make dirty power more expensive?
More expensive for emitters, as you point out. And that's not what the government's trying to do with respect to consumers. They want consumers to be able to afford electricity, and that's why this project or this proposal seems to me to be a sensible one. If you can reduce the cost of electricity in households by up to $250 a year, then that should be welcomed by everybody, including the states, and I would expect that they would be happy to get on board with that. I mean, why should we be making a political football out of a proposal which is aimed at reducing the cost of power for individual households? That's a sensible measure. We do live in a world where climate change is a huge issue. Global warming's with us. We've seen that. We know that. We've got to do things, but we also have to make it possible for people to be able to use electricity on a daily basis in an affordable way. If this is what that's going to do, then we should give it all the support we can. This isn't the sort of thing the opposition should be attacking. This is an opportunity for them to do something which is quite outrageous and say, well done, Prime Minister, we'll climb on board with that proposal.
Well, putting aside the politics of this, and clearly there is an element here of, the government wanting to remind everyone that it's not just the carbon tax driving up power bills. What about some of the key elements of this plan, Graham? I mean, deregulating markets, having competition in the marketplace, isn't that something Liberals support?
Yeah, look, I don't mind some of that sort of stuff, actually. It's a bit hot politically in some of the states, but I don't mind the principle. But there are a lot of things that can be done. I have at home a new system, and you push a button in the shower, you've got to wait for 2 minutes, so brush your teeth, whatever.
Hang on, Grahame Morris, the climate crusader. Yeah.
But then I've got instant hot water, but when I don't use it, there's nothing. There's nothing in the house that's being heated, so you're saving energy. Now the government could, except they got poor form on pink bats going into houses and everything, but they could, give everyone a couple of $100 to sort that out.
Or a smart meter. Now, there's a question over who pays for that.
It's the same sort of thing.
So you can see what you're paying each time you flick on the air conditioner.
Well, yeah, I think mine is a bit better, because the problem with the smart meter is, yes, people, they shift their usage a bit to, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 7 o'clock in the morning. But when families are using their electricity the most around meal times or when the kids are showering, watch the price go up. Because, people are still going to have to make a buck. So, yes, when there's not much use, the price will go down, but when mums and dads and families are using it, it'll go up. So they'll lose anyway.
I'm looking forward to Grahame Morris driving an electric car as well. Let's move on to one of the other areas the government is hoping to secure some more agreement on Friday. That's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It dominated the last COAG meeting, and we did see eventually New South Wales and Victoria sign up to trials of this, along with Tasmania and South Australia. Some of the details around those trials are still to be settled. That's expected to happen, but also the government's pretty keen to have Western Australia and Queensland sign up in principle to a national deal here, because even though they're not having trials, their involvement in any national scheme will be critical. There is still a big question mark over how this is paid for, and we'll get to that. But I just want to show you both Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott addressed what was a National Disability Services CEO conference in Sydney today. Julia Gillard copped a bit of flack from the floor during her speech from a woman in a wheelchair. Have a look.
We really need you to talk to us, and I promise you we will be listening.
Prime Minister, are you aware that disability pension is nearly 57% of national minimum wage? Unless you're blind or vision impaired, people with permanent disabilities, like myself, are only allowed to earn a maximum of $152 per fortnight before pension payments are adversely affected. This discrimination has existed for over 60 years, and the recent work bonus for aged pensioners is just another disabling ailment of this government. I am permanently wheelchair-bound and incontinent after school bullying drove me to suicide. The pension alone does not even cover my ongoing medical needs and appointments, to the point I had to go to the local rehab centre and literally steal disposable continence supplies to be able to manage 2 nights here in Sydney. I will never be able to work full-time, but because of every dollar income I earn, reduces my pension by 50% or 50 cents, I would need to work for a minimum of 27 hours every single week just to equal minimum wage.
Okay, well, we're listening, and what I can do is ask a staff member who is here, Robin, to speak to you.
Yeah, the Prime Minister perhaps not too worried about that particular intervention there, but pointing out from the floor just how difficult it is for many of those living with disabilities. Now, Tony Abbott also addressed that summit, that conference. He gave pretty strong backing to the concept, at least, of a national disability insurance scheme.
It is right and proper that vulnerable Australians should receive the same level of service, regardless of how their vulnerability or their disability was caused, regardless of which state they live in. The services that you get should not depend upon your address or whether or not you've won the litigation lottery.
Grahame, that's a pretty good summation there of why we need an NDIS, but the key here is how to pay for it, and that's where the Coalition still has concerns. Why is it so difficult for both sides, if they agree with the concept, to be frank about the way to pay for it?
Well, both sides do agree, and I agree with it. But, you know, you do have to pay for it. And look, if we're talking about it strongly 7 years ago, or maybe in a couple of years' time, we would have a different economic climate. But somebody has to pay for it. And I think the problem here, it's expectations. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's the education sector, scientists, tax reform, families, family living standards, the disability scheme. You have the Prime Minister gonna do this, gonna do that, huge expectations. And it's all urine and flatulence. You know, it's put off into the never,
But
and you get some
cuts
very
the same way for
people.
the Coalition too, doesn't it? If they want to do this.
Yeah, but they didn't promise it in the first place. They didn't bring up the expectations. And I tell you, David, it is probably the most powerful thing anyone had ever said to me, and it's in this area. And I was in Queensland, and I'd helped get a younger Anna Bligh was the minister, and I'd helped get an extra $6 million with her to an organisation that looked after disabled people. And this very frail little lady came to me, and she had two huge sons who were about 40, but big men. But they had the mental capacity of a 7, 8, 9-year-old, but the sexual urges and everything of a 40-year-old. But they relied on Mum. Mum couldn't leave the room. Mum couldn't go anywhere. Mum was, and she came up to me and she said, "Mr. Morris," she said, "thank you for helping us get this extra money. But tell me, when am I allowed to die?" And you think, well, what is going to happen when that lady is no longer around to look after those two big men? And you think, you know, that is a system that needs help.
It is broken. Bruce Hawker, I don't think anyone doubts the need for this, but just getting back to how to pay for it, both sides of politics do seem to dismiss the idea of a levy, although not entirely ruling it out. Is it too politically difficult to be frank about having a new tax levy charge to pay for this?
Well, if you can get bipartisan support for the proposition, then that would seem to me to be a sensible way of approaching it. But, of course, the concern is that the government will come out and say, yeah, we should have a levy, and then Tony Abbott will come out and say, well, there's our one new big tax. And, you know, as sure as God made little green apples, I think that's the response that you would get from him, and therefore we would get a politicisation of the issue that we don't want to see happening. So I think that's the main reason why you wouldn't see a levy being put forward by the government. If, however, he were to say, well, we think a levy is an appropriate way to go, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is on this, or I'm going to put the people's money where its mouth is on this, then that would be a welcome move. I mean, this is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost, what's it, $9 billion, I think, in a year once it's fully operational. That is a heck of a lot of money. And my concern about this is it'll be a bit like the emissions trading scheme. Everyone thought it was a great idea when they thought that somebody else was paying for it and there wasn't going to be any implications. As soon as it looked like there were going to be cost implications for consumers, it became a much less popular scheme. And, you know, that still flows over with the carbon tax right now. So I think, you know, with schemes like this, we should be very frank on a bipartisan basis. If Tony Abbott is saying that he is Dr. Yes on this, then I think the Prime Minister and the opposition leaders should get together and say this is how we're going to pay for it. Because my real concern is that further down the line, the opposition's going to start humming and hawing about whether they can really afford it. And some of the public enthusiasm for the proposal might start to wane as people recognise that this is something that they are going to have to actually put their hands in their pockets for. It's not Julia Gillard, it's not Tony Abbott who's going to pay for this, it's the Australian public. They should do it. I'd support a levy, but I think it should be done on a bipartisan basis.
Somehow I can't see Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott sitting down and working cooperatively on this side of the election next year.
That's the problem.
Just final quick one. The AW slush fund matter. Now, clearly the opposition is still pursuing this, calling for a judicial inquiry. We've seen them pursue that still today. The latest poll, we saw that essential figure earlier, marked down the opposition and the media for their handling of this. Grahame, do you think there are still gains to be made for the opposition in this?
I do, and I would have a proper inquiry, and I hope the coalition does if it ever gets into government. There is something there is huge maladministration and corruption at various levels of the trade union movement, and I think it's time we had a proper look at this and put in a system of governance in the trade unions that stop it. We've got some crooks running some trade unions.
Bruce, is putting together what we've seen at the AWU, the Health Services Union as well, is there a case for some level of inquiry?
Into the AW, into this amount? No, I think once somebody comes up with smoking gun evidence, then there should be an investigation. So far, we've got a lot of allegations from which the opposition constantly retreat. But I think what Grahame said is very interesting. I think we are going to see in the coming months a mounting campaign against unions from the Liberal Party. I think this is something we should be prepared to see. I think they're aching to get into the union movement over this issue. And I think the union movement should get ahead of the game as much as they can. I think certain levels of accountability that are applied to company directors and the like should be seriously looked at by the unions and by the government as ways of heading this off.
That's what Tony Abbott wants to do.
Yeah, well, I think that there's something to be said for that, but I think they want to go a lot further than that. I think they want to try to demonise unions generally, and I think we should be prepared to see that coming down the line in the next few months.
Bruce, Hawker, Grahame Morris, good to talk to you both. Thanks for that. We'll catch up next week. We're going to take a break, look at the interest rate decision coming tomorrow.